Greetings, everybody. I'm Scott Rodell here at the Great River Taoist Center, home to our Academy of Chinese Swordsmanship. People who regularly follow our channel are probably looking at this saber and thinking, that looks like a Chinese willow leaf. And you sort of be right. This is actually a Vietnamese Guom. They are strongly influenced by, and of course, the general shape, if you looked at it, step back and look at it in profile. In general shape, yes, it is like the willow leaf saber of China. And this is a Tonkin Guom. So that Tonkin is the area, northern part of Vietnam, which is, of course, right next to China. And we can expect Vietnamese to be strongly influenced by their larger neighbor. And we're going to see that, yes, there's quite a lot of influence of China on Vietnamese culture and on their weaponry. However, this is indeed a Vietnamese piece, as are these two sabers. Speaking of which, by the way, I will cover these in a future video, so make sure you're subscribed if you want to learn more about these. What I really love about this particular example is that it is a fighting sword. So many of the Vietnamese swords we see are of this court variety, and that creates a kind of survivor bias, we call it. You see these swords with the silver riposte work and the beautifully inlaid hardwood, the elephant tusk grips, all those sort of details. You start to think like that's what a Vietnamese saber is like. As I said earlier, these Vietnamese sabers are really a quite interesting mix of different cultures, different aesthetics, from China, from Japan, later on from France, as obvious from the D guards that we have on these swords. But when we only see these kinds of swords, we can't forget that, that's not what people are really fighting with. This is a real fighting example. And so I'm really happy to have this one to examine, to really get the feel for how it works, how I might train with it. So how do we know? First, some people might be asking, well, how do you know? I mean, if you look at that and go, that looks very Chinese to me from a distance. Yes, I might think it's also Chinese. How do I know that it's Vietnamese? Well, there's a number of really distinct features that we can say for certain that this is a Vietnamese sword. One is, it is a bit lighter, and that is some indication. But of course, Chinese swords were also, Duan Dao were also about this size and weight and everything. But one thing we see quite clearly here is at the end, we have these two fullers. And at the end of those fullers, we have this kind of undulating scroll work, sort of vine, kind of stylistic kind of way of thing. And that's very typical Vietnamese work. And we have that on both sides of the blade. At the base of the blade, we have something that's very Chinese. We have 4 characters, Ban Ming Tang Sun, which is, when translated literally, would be this life, Ban Ming, like the life I'm living now, Chang Shen, should be a long life. So this time around, give me a long life, which is, probably a good thing to put on a sword, just kind of a little, for good luck, kind of an incantation. This blade itself is also really good steel, I should say. Something that is certainly of a Chinese influence. This sword, again, this is a fighting sword. If you compare the blades of these fighting examples, I wish we had more to really examine it and see how they work, how they handle. Compare it with these court swords. These blades are really rather flimsy. They wouldn't stand up in a fight at all. This is a good solid blade. It's made of a lamellar steel, people often call Damascus. It has that sort of jacket of steel, that laminated steel, and inserted into that is the edge. So that kind of wraps around that hardened edge, and that steel at that edge is really, really quite high carbon, quite hard, so really gives a nice solid cut, will maintain its edge for a long time. So it's a good, solid fighting sword. And as I said, these examples of these fighting pieces are rather rare, especially in comparison with the court swords. I mean, you can tell why. Tourists, colonizers, French, would probably have taken this home as a souvenir over something that looks a little more pedestrian like this. Other stylistic influences, I mentioned the Japanese and also, you could say, Southeast Asia, Thai. If we look at the sword, blade-wise, yes, That's very Chinese. It's very much a Lu Yue Dao, a willow leaf style of blade. And again, you know, I mean, if I saw that, yeah, if I saw that at a distance, I might automatically think Chinese. However, when we look at the grip, for example, this grip it's thicker, it's bulges the way more way a Jian grip would. Chinese don't do this on their sabers. So it bulges a little bit. It's quite comfortable in the grip. I really, you know, provides for a good, solid, comfortable grip. I feel like, yeah, I can deliver a good, solid blow with this sword. So it fits very nicely in the hand. But also the way we see it has this sort of very wide fuller here, ferrule here, and the pommel. That reminds me much more of like Tai Da and Southeast Asian weapons. That is not at all the way Chinese would tend to do that. It would be a much narrower ferrule there. Also, of course, you have the flaring pommels, variety of different pommels, not this sort of simple cylindrical pommel. The cross-section of this wood grip is a nice, solid hardwood grip. That cross-section is an oval, rather fat oval, almost a circle, which is much more like the swords of Southeast Asia, and I'd say it's much more like a cross-section of a katana than it is of a Chinese sword. So we have a blade, yeah, it's very Chinese in style, but a grip that is not. Likewise, here at the guard, right here at this, of course, the octagonal guard you see them occasionally on Chinese swords, but it's not really common at all, not standard, I would say. But you also have this little washer here, which is something you would see on a Japanese sword that you do not see on a Chinese sword. So Vietnamese swords, yeah, that's what I find is really, really interesting about these Vietnamese swords is how they are a mix of all the cultures around them. They've taken the things that they liked from those cultures and did their own thing with them. So terribly interesting to me. This particular example is not very long. If this were a Chinese blade, we might call it a duan dao, a short sword. But we have to keep in mind context. Vietnamese people are generally of more slighter build, not quite as tall. Earlier on, they were just even with some of the emperors, only about 4.5, 5 foot tall. So they weren't particularly big people. So the sword makes sense that it's not as long a heavy sword. It has to be one that people can wield. So this one is 23 3/4 inches long. That's 60 centimeters. It's 30 from tip to pommel. It's 30 and a half, 77 centimeters. It's about 1.33 pounds or 612 grams. So just heavy enough that, yeah, bang, I can give a good solid cut with it. If I have to, yes, I could do that. It reels nicely. You know, it feels, of course, having trained with heavier swords, it does feel a little bit light to me, but it doesn't feel flimsy. I can deliver a very solid cut with it. Of course, whenever I get a sword, I'm sure you're thinking the same thing. Whose sword was this? Who wielded this sword? One thing we see, we look at the photographic record that, you know, and we have to also keep, always say this, always got to keep context in mind. When we look at the photographic record, we see that these are often employed with a shield. Now, the Vietnamese shield is a long oval shield. Sometimes they're made of wood. Sometimes they're made of wicker. You hold it in the center and they hold it out. So it probably wasn't particularly heavy if you can hold it like this. And wicker shield doesn't have to be very heavy, or wicker or rattan. And that's nice and solid and it's easy to make. And by the way, again, context, Vietnam is quite a hot place compared to other places in Asia, compared to Japan, compared to China, except for southern China. And if you think about military situation, men usually going into battle would want to wear armor. However, when it's so hot, you can't wear armor because you have to have a padded layer, then whatever the outer layer is, that hard layer that's going to stop the cuts, you need to have something solid, a metal, leather, whatever. And it's just simply too hot. You cannot suffer heat exhaustion in the middle of a battle, and you will if you're in the tropics and you're wearing what would be like winter clothing. So what do? They use a shield, the same thing they did in southern China with the rattan shields with the saber. So that was their answer to that. What that means sword-wise is I don't need as heavy a sword. I can come in, cut, and very quickly countercut. I get more speed from a lighter sword. And that is going to be very beneficial, on that battlefield, that I can be a little bit faster. If my enemy, my Duifang, is just in clothing, probably even has shorts, right? It's just hot, right? And has that shield. Once I can get past that shield, if I get over, I don't need a particularly heavy cut. So lighter and faster is probably going to make much more sense than the Chinese way of a longer, heavier sword. And also, again, people are of slighter builds, so you can't use as heavy a sword, in generally speaking. Also, we have to think this sword is probably 19th century. The only way I could say for certain would be if I could remove the hilt and examine the tang, which obviously I'm not going to do. Judging from the patina and tang, I could get a good idea of when this sword dates from. But I would say comfortably it's earlier 19th century, given its style. It might be late 18th century, but just general patina, general wear, I'd say no, probably more likely early 19th century. But by that time, firearms were in widespread use with the Vietnamese military. In fact, when the Qianlong Emperor of China invaded Vietnam, they really gave them a run for their money because they adopted guerrilla tactics and they were so good with their firearms. And firearms use doesn't just go into the modern era. And in actuality, firearms were in widespread use in Vietnam for hundreds of years, dating back to what would have been the Ming Dynasty, the Ming period in China. The Vietnamese already were well-versed in the use of matchlocks. So a weapon like this was really probably a secondary weapon. If you're a soldier, your primary weapon is going to be your bow or your matchlock. I would like to take out the enemy when he's way over there. Secondary is going to be the spear. A sword like this is probably the backup weapon. So again, you don't need it to be, if you're down to that situation where you've lost your spear or you're finally in a melee, this is going to be just fine. It's short, sweet, and will do the trick. So if that's on your side, you don't want a long sword necessarily that's in the way. The other thing, though, is that we look at historical record. We have photos from the pre-colonial period. We have photos from later on, and we see women training with swords. We have photos of women doing their sword forms. We also see photos of women with this on their side. So a sword like this, a real fighting example of a Vietnamese saber, a Guom, a sword like this carried by a woman also makes a lot of sense. If you're not training all the time, you're not a professional soldier, but you had some training, the average sort of what we call hobbyist kind of training today, this would be a great weapon for a woman to carry day to day. It's not cumbersome. If she's going between villages to the field, wherever, this is not a big, heavy weapon that she has to really lug around, but it's big enough to do the job if she needs it to. So these could very well have been a woman's sword that she used for her everyday carrier. We don't unfortunately know a lot about these. I hope that in the comments, if anybody has more information, you will definitely put it there and give us links to things, because it's a very interesting topic. We don't know a whole lot about Vietnamese sword work today, but what's interesting is that we have photos from as late as 1948 of Vietnamese women militias armed with these and even training with them. So interesting that well up until the French colonial period, these weapons were in use by a woman, probably for self-defense, right? And maybe to help drive the French out. So I hope you've enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed talking about it. Really find these Vietnamese swords fascinating. We'll come back and talk about other varieties in the future, so please do subscribe. Also, if you think it's worth it, give us that thumbs up and leave us a comment. I really want to hear from other people who may know more about these so we can all learn something. Until next time, thanks and 再见.